everyone, and welcome to the Rising Like Incense podcast. I'm your host, Tom Canuel, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the second half of the twofold goal of liturgy. For those who can remember our last episode, not really too long ago, part one of this particular segment talked about how the goal of liturgy is to glorify God. But today we're going to be talking about how liturgy, according to Vatican II, has the power to sanctify. Since this will be coming up a lot in our episode today, let's just clarify what I mean by the word sanctify right off the bat. To sanctify simply means to make holy, to set apart. So, whenever we refer to the Mass as having the power to sanctify, it means that the graces present at the Mass have the power to bring us into right relationship with God, to set us apart from our attachments and what the rest of the world thinks we should desire on a day to day basis. So, today we'll break down the ways Vatican II understood how the Mass has this power to sanctify and ultimately how beauty plays a role in this. Without further ado, let's just dive right in. Now, if you looked at the timestamp of this episode, you may notice that this is actually our shortest episode here on Rising Like Incense, and for good reason. For the most part, we already know that the Mass helps to bring us closer to God, and we also know that the Mass kind of separates us from the rest of the world. Like, just take your own experience as a Catholic. We know that when we receive Christ in the Eucharist, that his presence in us, that, in receiving his body and blood, invites us to be different, to love and to preach the gospel to all. And in our last episode, when we were talking about the goal of sanctification, the process of sanctifying the faithful, it's always put in conversation with the goal of liturgy to glorify God. But why would Vatican II want to emphasize this particular theme within the context of beauty? Why sanctification? Well, there's a few reasons for that. First, there's something that can be said about how, beauty and certainly the process of sanctification reinforces our understanding of the Eucharist. We talked a lot about this in our last episode, but to review, the Council understood liturgy as the source and summit of our faith. Therefore, all prayer and everything we do should stem from the Mass, and rightly so. But this also means that the sanctifying power of Christ finds its source and summit in the liturgy, and more specifically in our reception of the Eucharist during the Mass. In other words, the Council's focus on this process of sanctifying us, of making us holy, reinforces that the liturgy is the source and summit because we are sanctified by it. Simply put, the Eucharist is just a gift that keeps on giving. Makes sense. However, that's not all. And for this next point, we need to revisit a principle that just keeps coming up over and over again: active participation. In Mediator Dei, thinking way back to episode 2, Pius the 12th declared that the action being done during the Mass does not necessarily depend on our attention to the Mass, but it's not the end of the story. In speaking about the graces of the Eucharist, Pius the 12th emphasizes that, quote, to produce their proper effect, it is absolutely necessary that our hearts be properly disposed to receive them, end quote. Certainly when we think about the Eucharist, right, we think about our disposition at Mass, but this principle was not lost in Vatican II, which is why the Council says very early on in Article 11 that the faithful must, quote, take part fully aware of what they are doing, actively engaged in the rite and enriched by it, end quote. The sanctifying grace of the Mass cannot take full effect without directing our attention fully to what's happening during the liturgy, which is why participation is so important. So, with that said, we may wonder, how does this relate to beauty? Well, we've already mentioned in our last episode that sacred music has the ability to unite our minds. Unity is one part of the working of God's action in sanctifying us, too. Like, think about it. If we believe that in heaven we'll all worship God for eternity, which is awesome, there is a sense of unity that's kind of required by that. And when we think of St. Paul's letters, and he talks about the church as the body of Christ, the body, in order to work properly, has to be united. In the same way, sacred music cultivates unity through participation. Everyone singing God's praise together and lifting their voices in song to the Father. However, in our last episode, we didn't talk as much about how sacred art does this. Well, in Article 122, and again, we're kind of revisiting this article over and over again, we said that the purpose of sacred art was ultimately, quote, to turn the people's spirits devoutly to God, end quote. If the liturgy has the power to lift towards God, it means we would have to be turning away from something. Namely, that we would be having to be set apart from the rest of the world. Sacred art, in that sense, has this kind of religious sense that it has this power to glorify, but it also inspires the believer to go out and live a holy way of life that's different from the way of life of the rest of the world. So, with that said, that is the power of the Mass. Power of the Mass has the power to sanctify us, to make us holy, and to bring us on that path ultimately to sainthood. But coming up in our next episode, we'll talk about the concept of liturgical catechesis, the ways that we pass down our knowledge of the liturgy in the Mass to all members of the Church. We'll explore why this was so important to the council, which we've kind of already gotten some hints of. We've already talked a lot about catechesis, but also how the intentions of catechesis were directed towards, get this, active participation. Just like we talked about today, just as like we've been talking about throughout this whole series. And of course, what this means for catechesis when it comes to beauty and art and music. So stay tuned to learn more. Pun kind of partially intended, get it? Because it's catechesis. We learn. Anyway, my name is Tom Canuel, and we'll see you next time on Rising Like Incense.